Flight attendant slaps American billionaire's son. Then he makes a call, and the whole flight is suspended. He sat quietly in first class, polite, with his ticket in hand. No one paid any attention to him, not even the flight attendant, until she stopped, looked at him, and asked him to move. In front of all the passengers, she accused him of lying and slapped his hand, forcing him to the back of the plane. No one spoke up to defend him. No one said a word. He didn't protest, didn't scream, didn't make a fuss. He just quietly picked up the phone and made a silent call. Within minutes, the flight was delayed. The crew began to panic, and the stewardess, who thought she could control the cabin, realized she had just insulted the wrong person. What happened next shocked everyone on board and changed her life forever, before the wheels even lifted. Before we get started, leave a comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Jay walked into the first-class cabin of the flight, his steps light, but each step carried something different, as if he didn't belong here. He wore a simple black hoodie, neat jeans, and bright white sneakers, nothing outstanding but full of meaning. Anyone who took a quick look would only see a 17-year-old youth, with a simple appearance, nothing special. He held the headphones in his hand, preparing to put them on, but then stopped, let out a gentle breath, and sat down on the seat next to the window. There was no rush or impatience like people who often encountered this situation for the first time. To him, this flight seemed like a part of normal life, nothing to worry about. As he sat down, Jay pulled out a luxurious black velvet box from his backpack with the Cole Global logo delicately engraved on the lid. The box wasn't large, but it was enough to catch the eye of anyone who paid attention. It wasn't anything too obvious, but anyone who knew the Cole family would immediately recognize it as a symbol of power and lasting wealth. Jay placed the box on the food tray, but didn't open it, simply leaving it there as a subtle reminder of his true identity. It seemed like no one around him cared. The other passengers continued with their own work. Some had laptops open, some were engrossed in their phones, while others were taking short naps. No curious or judgmental glances were directed at Jay. They saw only a 17-year-old boy, polite, calm-faced, sitting quietly in the middle of the first-class cabin like everyone else. Little did they know that this young man, with his plain appearance, was the son of a globally influential family, with power and wealth that many could only dream of. But none of these people could have guessed that. They looked at Jay, but they didn't see him. And Jay, he didn't need them to see him. He just had to do what he had to do, be in the right place at the right time. He just kept quiet, put the box down, quietly put his headphones back on, and closed his eyes, preparing for the flight. Amidst the hustle and bustle, no one realized that they were sitting next to the person who could change everything with just one phone call. The plane had begun to taxi, gently lifting off the ground. The air in the passenger cabin had become soft, but there was still an invisible tension spreading. It was the indifference, the unintentional separation of the people around them. Everyone was busy with their own world, not paying the slightest attention to anything happening outside of their familiarity. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the silence. Tina, the flight attendant, stood right next to Jay, her eyes sharp and her frown unconcealable. "This seat is for first-class passengers only," she said, her tone devoid of any respect. It wasn't a question, but a powerful statement, full of contempt. Jay raised his head, looking at her with a gentle gaze, his deep eyes unwavering. He didn't respond immediately, just gently pulled the plane ticket from his pocket and handed it to her, as if it was the obvious thing she needed. But what happened next made the atmosphere in the cabin suddenly tense. Tina looked at the ticket in her hand indifferently, her lips stretched out in contempt, then suddenly slapped Jay's hand. "Back to coach. Now," she shouted, her voice like fire. The sound echoed throughout the first-class cabin, causing the entire flight to freeze. The surrounding passengers turned to look, but only for a second, their eyes quickly averted, no one daring to face the truth that was happening right before their eyes. Everyone continued with their work, as if what had just happened had nothing to do with them. But in that tense atmosphere, they did not realize that their eyes were evaluating, judging, even though they said nothing. Jay didn't say a word. His hands were clenched, his fingers trembling slightly, but he didn't let his anger or frustration show. After a brief moment, he let go. His body relaxed like a gentle breeze and stood up quietly. What happened next wasn't an argument. He didn't scream, he didn't protest. He just kept quiet, walking slowly towards the back of the plane. It felt like everything that was happening was unbelievable. A public insult, and Jay, just by remaining silent, showed himself stronger than ever. Not a word spoken, not a protest, but there was an invisible strength, a resilience that only those who truly understood the value of respect and dignity could recognize. The plane had begun to taxi, gently lifting off the ground. The air in the passenger cabin had become soft, but there was still an invisible tension spreading. It was the indifference, the unintentional separation of the people around them. Everyone was busy with their own world, not paying the slightest attention to anything happening outside of their familiarity. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the silence. Tina, the flight attendant, stood right next to Jay, her eyes sharp and her frown unconcealable. "This seat is for first-class passengers only," she said, her tone devoid of any respect. It wasn't a question, but a powerful statement, full of contempt. Jay raised his head, looking at her with a gentle gaze, his deep eyes unwavering. He didn't respond immediately, just gently pulled the plane ticket from his pocket and handed it to her, as if it was the obvious thing she needed. But what happened next made the atmosphere in the cabin suddenly tense. Tina looked at the ticket in her hand indifferently, her lips stretched out in contempt, then suddenly slapped Jay's hand. "Back to coach. Now," she shouted, her voice like fire. The sound echoed throughout the first-class cabin, causing the entire flight to freeze. The surrounding passengers turned to look, but only for a second, their eyes quickly averted, no one daring to face the truth that was happening right before their eyes. Everyone continued with their work, as if what had just happened had nothing to do with them. But in that tense atmosphere, they did not realize that their eyes were evaluating, judging, even though they said nothing. Jay didn't say a word. His hands were clenched, his fingers trembling slightly, but he didn't let his anger or frustration show. After a brief moment, he let go. His body relaxed like a gentle breeze and stood up quietly. What happened next wasn't an argument. He didn't scream, he didn't protest. He just kept quiet, walking slowly towards the back of the plane. It felt like everything that was happening was unbelievable. A public insult, and Jay, just by remaining silent, showed himself stronger than ever. Not a word spoken, not a protest, but there was an invisible strength, a resilience that only those who truly understood the value of respect and dignity could recognize. At that moment, in the stifling silence, Jay pulled out his phone, opened the screen, and went to his contacts. He didn't rush, he didn't seem nervous. He just gently pressed the call button. And then, in the moving plane, Jay was able to make his call. Not through the regular connections, but through a special satellite phone system reserved for first-class passengers. It was a privileged service, not available to all passengers. It was technology reserved for the upper class, allowing them to connect to the outside world even after the plane had begun to take off, when there was no cell signal. No one in the cabin noticed this, but everyone felt the difference from the moment Jay looked at them. He was able to make a call while the others continued to hide in their own private spaces. The silence in the cabin stretched on as if time had stopped. Jay never took his eyes off the window, never once turning back to look at the eyes that were beginning to fall on him. He sat there, a still figure, but hidden within that was a patience and power that no one could have predicted. Everything outside him flowed silently. But just a small movement of his lips, just a small press of a button on the phone, made what was happening irreparable. A few minutes later, the captain's announcement broke the suffocating silence in the cabin. His voice was calm but clear. "Please be informed. We will be returning to the airport to resolve an emergency. Please remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts." His words were short, but carried a seriousness that no one in the cabin could ignore. The atmosphere immediately became tense, and all eyes began to look forward. Everything except Jay, except Tina, seemed strangely quiet, as if the whole flight was quietly preparing for a sudden change. Just then, the airline manager, whom none of the passengers could immediately recognize, entered the cabin. Obviously a powerful person in this organization, she walked through the rows of seats, her eyes falling on Tina, the flight attendant who had caused the incident. Tina's expression changed instantly, her previous confidence gone, replaced by a barely concealed confusion. She turned around and looked around, trying to hide the anxiety in her mind, but she couldn't. The feeling of unease began to show on her face. A pilot passed by, and in a gesture that was almost imperceptible, he whispered a sentence into Tina's ear, making her more confused than ever. "Do you know who that kid is?" It was not a normal question, but a sentence full of hidden meaning, making Tina's face pale, and her confidence completely disappeared. She stood there, confused, and then a strange look flashed in her eyes, but Tina still did not dare to say anything. A feeling of fear seemed to be rising in her, as if the truth she could not understand had come crashing down. And then, the eyes in the cabin began to focus on each other. They began to peek. Suddenly, someone furtively took out their phones, hastily typing a name into the search screen. J. Cole. In just a few short seconds, numbers and information appeared on the screens, causing a few passengers to whisper to each other. They realized that the name was more than just a name. A prominent name, a powerful family, someone they never thought would be on this flight. The atmosphere in the cabin suddenly changed. The sense of power that Tina had felt before was now like a fragile fabric being torn apart. Everything began to be revealed, and in the silence, everyone felt the invisible change taking place. The passengers said nothing, but they began to understand. And Tina, the confident flight attendant, was now standing in the middle of an undeniable truth. As the plane touched down on the emergency runway, the business class cabin remained tensely silent. None of the passengers understood what was happening, but they all sensed that something was about to change. Not from the loudspeakers, but from the atmosphere, where the flight attendants began to look at each other, worried. The cabin door opened, without noise, without urgency. A man in a dark suit appeared, without insignia, without badge, without secretary. Just him, with his calm posture and his eyes that silenced the entire cabin. Mark Cole. He needed no introduction, no warning. The captain even stepped aside as he passed. Tina stood frozen in place, her throat tight because there were faces that you could see with one look. You had just made an irreversible mistake. Mark looked at no one but Jay. His son sat still, his eyes fixed on the window, as if everything that had just happened had been a test of his composure. No anger, no scolding, no questioning. Mark just glanced at the flight attendant who had just insulted his son, and stopped there. "You've made a decision," he said, his voice neither high nor low, just loud enough for everyone present to hear. "Now we will too." No one in the cabin moved, because in that moment, the man didn't need power to threaten. He was the very definition of power, and it was only just beginning. Under the soft light from the cabin ceiling, the business class cabin seemed to have just gone through a silent storm. There was no more chatter, no more avoiding glances. Everyone was motionless, as if waiting for something approaching, irreversible. Two security guards walked in, followed by a manager wearing an airline name tag, holding a tablet and an unwavering gaze. They didn't speak loudly, just exchanged a few words with the captain through their eyes, then stopped in front of Tina's seat, who had been standing there all this time, her face pale, her shoulders shaking slightly. Before she could react, the manager leaned over and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "You're being replaced on this flight. Please gather your belongings." A moment of silence erupted in everyone's hearts. No one clapped, no one cheered, just a few seconds that seemed to last forever. Then a female passenger in the middle cabin clapped twice. The applause was thin but resounding, spreading like a domino effect. Not wild, just a recognition. A kind of justice that someone had just witnessed, enough for them to shake off their previous indifference. Tina bowed her head, bit her lip, and dragged her suitcase toward the door without daring to look up at anyone. And just then, a new flight attendant, tall, neatly uniformed, male, walked in as if he had been waiting for her. He smiled professionally, nodded to each passenger, and stopped in front of the front row. Jay was back in his seat, the one that had been taken away from him without cause. He was still wearing his dark hoodie, his headphones back on, but this time he didn't close his eyes or dodge. He opened his phone, typed a few lines, as if to close this silent opening chapter in his mind. Power is not how loudly you speak, it's how deeply you listen. The screen flickered on, then off. There was no anger or triumph in his gaze, just the calm of someone who had learned to let go of petty things without letting them diminish his heart. As the plane quietly drifted into the landing zone, the applause in the business class cabin was silent. Tina stood silently in the corner of the cabin, her neat uniform now an uncomfortable shell on her body. When the airline staff escorted her to the aisle, she turned back briefly, her eyes meeting Jay, who was sitting still, his headphones removed, his gaze still as calm as before, as if all the recent events had never touched him. No one asked for an apology, but Tina paused, as if pulled by an invisible string. Her voice was so low it was almost a gasp from her chest. I didn't know. Jay didn't look up or turn away. He just slowly closed the phone, which still displayed the note he'd written, and looked up, meeting her eyes for a moment. A small nod, not forgiveness, not blame, just an acknowledgement that it had happened, and what remained was a matter of learning from it. I don't need you to know who I am, Jay said, his voice low, but not cold. I just need you to know how you look at others. Tina said nothing more. And perhaps she didn't need to, because when she left, her shoulders were no longer as straight as when she had entered, but slumped. Not because of defeat, but because she was beginning to realize the price of the superficiality she had once thought was power. Behind her, a new flight attendant walked by, placing a glass of water on Jay's table without a word. But the gesture, and the respectful nod, said more than any excuse in the world. J. Cole's story teaches us about the power of dignity and silence in the face of injustice. He didn't shout, he didn't defend himself. But that silence, it was enough to bring the entire plane to a halt. Because sometimes power lies not in shouting, but in remaining calm. Jay, a young black man, did not retaliate. There was no need to react violently. But his silence was louder than any words, and the echo forced the entire system to pause, turn around, and look inward. It was not just Tina who had to face her actions. Everyone on board that day, who had been silent, who had been indifferent, was forced to ask themselves, were they unwittingly complicit in injustice? Because injustice doesn't always wear uniforms or raise fists. Sometimes it wears a flight attendant's uniform, lipstick, and a smile, and decides who deserves respect. And those who choose to stay silent, thinking it doesn't concern them, they're helping perpetuate that injustice. But not today. Not on this flight. Today, Justice stepped in without a word. He sat in seat 2A, looked out the window, and waited. And when the world looked back, he saw himself, reflected in the image of a teenage boy with nothing to prove, because the truth spoke for itself. Let this story be a mirror that reflects not only the flaws in the system, but also the quiet strength of those who confront it with integrity. Let it remind us that silence, when it comes from dignity, is not weakness. It is a storm waiting for its moment to speak, and may we raise a generation that doesn't need to be told what's right. A generation that understands. True power is not how strong your words are, but how strong your voice is, how strong your voice is, and how strong your voice is.